Really good.
Mix them up.
I thought I was mixing up.
Yeah.
All right. 169. So the 170 range is very popular. Okay. We were doing so well.
Yeah, you fixed it.
Yes, I did. 166, that's a little better. 166. Dick, was that one of yours?
No.
Okay.
Actually, that should be.
Speaker?
And Pat, pass on next person.
No,
You sure?
no, you got, no.
Next person.
If you got multiple, 168.
Next slide. Do it again.
Okay. You guys are very generous with your ticket sales tonight.
Yeah, we did not have a broad spectrum.
175.
Is it 175? I think we got 175. Yeah, that's somebody else's. Pass it on. Unless you. Yeah.
176.
I think we pretty much, I
Yeah.
know there's one person who hasn't been selected
Okay.
yet.
All right. So
Yeah,
who has
skip 176.
who has bought tickets but did not
We're gonna
get
get-
called yet? Why don't you go grab a book?
I'm gonna get to you
You
sooner or
get
later.
I'll take the 170s.
Perfect.
Yeah. All of them. By all means, feel free to grab a book.
They're gonna get to you eventually, because I know how many were sold tonight.
Right, exactly.
You got it.
Exactly. So, all right, gang, we're gonna move on from that. I have a little bit of housekeeping to do this evening before we jump into the speaker. As some of you may have seen, we just posted up on the Facebook page for the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable that there is a preservation threat that has come into Emmitsburg. The toll house up there at Emmitsburg is under demolition threat. There was no public announcement about this, and so now there's a groundswell to try to get some support. So the Historic Landmarks Commission and the Historic Preservation Commission are both taking public comments, okay? So if you have an interest in seeing this historic structure, which actually had the Custer's Cavalry Brigade camped on the site of this structure, and the structure was there at the time during the Gettysburg campaign, I highly recommend you give either the Historic Landmarks Commission for Frederick County or the Historic Preservation Commission for the county an email or a note of some sort, okay? That contact information is on the Facebook page. If you're unfamiliar with that, just let me know and I'm happy to share that information with you as well. Is there any additional announcements? I know we've got, the weather was terrible today, but we've still got a lot of folks here. It's great to see everybody out here this evening. My name's Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. And if there are no additional announcements from either my board members or anyone in general, I'm going to start things off with the talk this evening. Our speaker, John Muller, is a fantastic writer and historian. He has written 2 separate books and is working on a third regarding Frederick Douglass. His work on Douglass, the Lion of Anacostia, is highly regarded. I highly recommend it as a study of Douglass in Washington, D.C. He has developed a talk for us this evening looking at Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland, specifically focusing on Frederick County. But he'll also let us know about the wide-ranging talks and discussions that Frederick Douglass was involved in throughout this part of the state and westward. So, John, come on up here. Thank you, sir.
All right, I have a pretty loud voice, but I will try to use this microphone. All right, I have about 30 slides. I'll try to give plenty of time for some question and answer. I really want to thank Matt Borders. He's been a friend for many years on the front lines of both the National Park Service and in the community organizing preservation efforts. I want to thank everyone for braving the beautiful weather this evening and coming out. I see a couple people ready to take notes. If at any time there's a specific thing you'd like me to maybe spend some more time on, just raise your hand. I want this to kind of be a little bit of a conversation. Sometimes I go a little quickly. Frederick Douglass is someone that probably most of us know. Who has been to his house in Washington? Excellent. Okay, so we definitely have some Douglassonians in the house this evening. Excellent. All right, well, a gentleman earlier was asking me if I'm a professional historian. So I like to consider myself, the term I use is a street historian, which is really like a local historian, a community historian that attends community meetings and lends their voice to preservation efforts. And something that I focused on over many years of doing Frederick Douglass research, and I'll plug. So this book came out in 2012. It is available at the Frederick County Public Library System. If you have a marina, you can get it in the interlibrary loan program. And it came out 13 years ago. I thought I was going to do many more books in between with children and other things. Take time, so I'm trying to finish up Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland that I hope will be published this year in our semi-centennial year, and include Douglass in Frederick City as well as some other locations of Western Maryland. So I'll just get right into this. I also want to thank the Civil War Medicine Museum for having me for a second time. I presented almost 5 years ago to the date. This was a Zoom presentation. The audio was not very good. So hopefully the audio will be a little bit improved on this live stream. I want to also thank everyone who's tuning in via YouTube. Please add any comments, questions online, and we'll try to answer them in turn. All right, so want to acknowledge our friends at the Civil War Medicine Museum and acknowledge that Frederick Douglass really was a man for all seasons. Okay, most people associate him as being an abolitionist, anti-slavery advocate, he was a suffragette, okay, advocated for women's rights many years before it was legislatively women had the right to vote. And so Douglass was friends with many radical women. Claire Barton is one of the many radical women reformers that he was friends with. Very interesting that when Douglass was serving as Recorder of Deeds of the District of Columbia, the Red Cross was incorporated. And I believe Frederick Douglass's signature is actually on the incorporation documents of the Red Cross. I don't know that Douglass, well, actually Claire Barton's house in Glen Echo, I think was kind of built after Douglass passed away. He passed away in 1895, but Douglass actually attended a Chautauqua in Glen Echo. That's our friends in Montgomery County. All right, so I just wanted to throw this to our dear friends at the Civil War Medicine Museum. This is from 1881. Claire Barton is writing to Frederick Douglass, and she writes, "Thanks, friend, for kind wishes, kind thoughts, and kind words. They smooth the rough places and lighten the shade, and teach though life's journey seems useless and dreary," kind of like this evening, "it struggles for naught to the soul sick and weary, that perhaps in some nook of God's world it has paid, and so after all it were well that 'twere made. Always sincerely your friend Clara Barton." So I just wanted to throw that for our audience tonight to show that Douglass is a man, as I said, for all seasons. All right, so Frederick Douglass spoke here in Frederick City, April 8, 1879. A term that is kind of more popular in European historical circles is psychogeography. Okay, it's kind of the history of where we are, the history of the place that we're occupying today. And I'm not really big on ghosts. Some people say there's a Frederick Douglass ghost at his house in Cedar Hill, but it's kind of like a friendly ghost. But Frederick Douglass is someone who walked Market Street. He arrived via the historic, train station, the Italian train station. He probably walked to Quinn Chapel. I don't have that confirmation, but it's very likely that he did view with his own eyes Quinn Chapel. So the kind of historic streetscape in Frederick City that we see today, which I don't really know the whole history of preservation of Frederick City, but I really want to applaud Frederick City that it is kind of a town or city that's kind of somewhat still, you can still see the past and feel the past. And so I feel, a certain Frederick Douglass synergy in the room tonight, because there are still many places in Frederick City that we know Frederick Douglass would have seen with his own eyes, and thankfully these buildings have been preserved. And so some of the key Places of interest of Frederick Douglass in Frederick City are the train station, which some may know is also the same train station where President Lincoln spoke from the back of the train there, and there's, I believe, the Civil War Trails sign there. Also, City Hall, Opera House, which is Brewer's Alley, which Matt was kind enough to treat me to a pulled pork sandwich earlier this evening. So Brewer's Alley, Frederick Douglass spoke in Brewer's Alley at that time. It was City Hall, it was also some ways an opera house. Frederick Douglass spoke up on the second floor where there was a large kind of larger seating area. And I would say I'm going to go through some of this tonight. I'm going to focus tonight more so than when I presented several years ago on who was on stage with Frederick Douglass and what that meant and why those people were on stage with him. And Quinn Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church on 3rd Street, and I guess the uptown neighborhood or uptown area of Frederick City. Frederick Douglass spoke to benefit that church, which is still an active congregation today. I don't know if anyone knows Thad Goodman. He's kind of the, I guess, historian of Quinn Chapel, involved with Quinn Chapel. They received a significant grant about a year or two ago to stabilize the building, and I think that they will then start to hold services again physically in that building. And that building has a lot of Civil War significance, which I'll briefly allude to that in a couple slides. All right, so Frederick Douglass in 1879. All right, now Douglass, what's important to understand, when he visits Frederick City, he is in fact serving as the United States Marshal of the District of Columbia. The United States Marshal is under the Department of Justice, had a little more kind of his cachet maybe back then than it does today. Today's kind of viewed as maybe just an administrative law position. Back then it was kind of, to a certain extent, part of the president's kind of security, sometimes security detail. When ambassadors and other people would visit Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass would be responsible for kind of coordinating security. A little bit before all the various Secret Service and other law enforcement agencies kind of have their defined roles today. But Douglass was very busy as marshal. Nothing to understand too certain things like the Hatch Act and other sorts of kind of ethics laws did not exist. So Douglass was able to serve as marshal and make political speeches, which today kind of technically not allowed. So when he's coming to Frederick, he is coming kind of with the authority of the Department of Justice as a close advisor of President Rutherford B. Hayes, which some may know. President Rutherford B. Hayes was wounded at the Battle of South Mountain. He's the only American president who was wounded in the Civil War. And this is Jonathan Banks's book. I'm not thinking of the title of the book. But Jonathan Banks has a great book. I'm sorry, the title escapes me, but he actually does a little chapter on the house where Rutherford B. Hayes recuperated. And Lucy Webb Hayes visited that home. And Frederick Douglass was friends with Lucy Webb Hayes, who was known as Lemonade Lucy because she did not serve alcohol at White House functions. So nonetheless, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was wounded in, I believe, the Frederick County side of the Battle of South Mountain, appointed Frederick Douglass as marshal. So Frederick Douglass visits Frederick City, Hagerstown, and Cumberland in 1879. Speaking in Frederick and Hagerstown, he's speaking to benefit the local African Methodist Episcopal churches. When Douglass speaks in Hagerstown, he speaks in the extant Washington County Courthouse on Washington, kind of near Washington, Potomac, or Washington and Jonathan Street. And the Moxley Band, which I'll mention a couple slides, the Moxley Band serenaded Frederick Douglass in Hagerstown. He was introduced in Hagerstown by Louis McComas, who would then go on to serve as United States Congressman, United States Senator, and his granddaughter, Catherine Byron, was the first woman elected to the United States House from Maryland. And Douglass was very close with these political, local and national political figures within the Republican Party who worked to advance the rights of freedmen. And that's really critical, and I'll get into that more. Spoke in Cumberland at an Emancipation Day celebration, and this was the only time that he spoke in Western Maryland that was outdoors. Okay, Douglass spent the night at the Queen City Hotel. I don't know if anyone here had the opportunity and pleasure to stay there. It's fortunately a preservation fight that was lost. But Douglass spoke to more than some estimates of 3,000 people in Cumberland. And this was a gubernatorial election year. The transcripts of his speeches he's more talking about the Exodus, which was, the Exoduster movement was kind of a precursor to the Great Migration. That was kind of like the political topic of the day. Somehow the movie Epstein Files is the political topic of contemporary times. Douglas addressed Exodus because that was a big issue of the day. And all of these speeches were very, very big local events and very significant. And as I mentioned 5 years ago, I continue to mention now, I believe that there could be a trail system or markers or something that identifies these locations, maybe helps to ensure their preservation. And I think that in the 250th anniversary and celebration of America, that Frederick Douglass is very integral to celebrating our collective community history. All right, so, and some of these connections that I draw of Frederick Douglass are kind of degrees of separation and associations. And something that's pretty important, I believe, is that Frederick Douglass was on the board of Howard University from 1872 to 1895. Frederick Douglass never attended a formal day of school in his life, but he served on the board of Wilberforce University, served on the board of Howard University, served on the board of Storer College in nearby Harpers Ferry. And Douglass was someone who was very close to several university presidents. Many faculty were close associates of Douglass. And several students who attended Freedmen's Bureau schools in Frederick County, and then later early the Maryland public schools had a white school system, colored school system. Several students and graduates from these systems matriculated to Howard University in Washington, D.C. This is from, I believe, October 1868. It's a report from the Freedmen's Bureau, and it lists 2 separate schools in Frederick City. Let's see if this pointer works. I think everybody can see. This pointer works. So Frederick City has 2 schools listed, one being at Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church on All Saints Street, the other school being affiliated with Quinn Chapel. There's also a school in Mount Pleasant, New Market, Liberty or Liberty Town, and Middletown. All right, so during the service of Frederick Douglass to Howard's board from 1871 to 1895, several students from descendant communities of Frederick County, Frederick City, and nearby areas attended the Co-Ed Integrated Institution of Higher Learning in Washington City, named for General Oliver Otis Howard, who I must admit I'm not a Civil War historian. I'm really sure everyone in the audience here knows more than I do about troop movements, the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg. So I don't really know exactly General Howard's history in Western Maryland, but there is a Civil War Trails marker outside of St. John's Episcopal Church in Hagerstown. There's a large bell tower, and I'm not really sure. I guess it might have been the Battle of Antietam, but General Howard was up there overlooking, doing some reconnaissance, and there's a marker for General Howard. So General Howard, before he was president of Howard University, would have been familiar with areas of Western Maryland. He attended Bowdoin College, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Harry Beecher Stowe attended, and he lost his right arm in the Battle of Fair Oaks. You can kind of see a little bit in that photograph. He's missing one of his arms. All right, so several of the students from several communities in Frederick County attended Howard University while Frederick Douglass was on the board. These communities are Adamstown, Burkittsville, Frederick City, Hopeland, Knoxville, Libertytown, Petersville, Sunnyside, Walkersville, and Yarlsburg, which is technically kind of Washington County, but it's right there on the bottom of the hill from Gathland State Park. And so I'm going to put that in the Frederick County side kind of line. Yarlsburg is very, very interesting. I don't know if anyone knows the history of Yarl Mahmoud. There's a book several years ago about him. He had some family. So Yarlsburg, the genesis of that name is actually named for a free black gentleman who was painted by, well, actually his sister, who was painted by Charles Wilson Peel. It's pretty interesting. All right, so Frederick Douglass, fully intended to speak and visit Frederick City at least twice before he did visit in 1879. He was announced as an emancipation celebration keynote speaker in 1867 and also in 1869. And the emancipation celebration, so Juneteenth now, June 19th, is associated historically with Texas. Maryland constitutional emancipation is November 1. Frederick City would annually, for many years during the following Civil War up until the early 1900s, would celebrate Emancipation Day in August. This was coinciding with emancipation in British West Indies. One of Frederick Douglass's most famous speeches was made to celebrate West Indian emancipation. And so this is pretty interesting. This is from the Baltimore American. Let's read this a little bit here. You can follow along. So this is from 1869. So much from the Baltimore American, much regret was expressed by those participating in the Emancipation celebration at Frederick City, Maryland on Tuesday last on account of the absence of Mr. Frederick Douglass, who had positively promised to be present and address the assemblage. Captain Henry Clay Nail of Frederick, who had been requested by the Committee of Arrangements to correspond with Mr. Douglass and John Mercer Langston and invite their attendance in his report to a meeting on Tuesday, detailed the correspondence between himself and Mr. Douglass and stated that some unauthorized person or persons had interfered to prevent his attendance for reasons best known to themselves. Mr. Douglass was on Saturday in Washington City with his son and actually on his way to Frederick to attend the celebration when he was surprised by a dispatch requesting him to stay away. But the following card, which we received from Mr. Douglass himself last night, explains the matter. Just read a little bit of this briefly here. So this is actually a letter written by Frederick Douglass to the editor of the Baltimore American. So this is the second, I'll just read the second paragraph. So Douglass writes, quote, "Then Douglass at this time is living in Rochester, New York." I want to acknowledge we just, special Doug Dobbs, aka Captain John Brown, is in the house, so now we have an extra importance to this evening. All right, so Douglass writes, quote, "More than a month ago, I was invited to deliver an address in Frederick City, Maryland by Mr. Henry Clay Nail. The date for the occasion was the 15th of August, which was subsequently changed by Mr. Nail to the 18th and still later to the 19th of August. I agreed to every change and pledged myself to be present. Well, now, why was I not present? Question mark. I will tell you and your respected readers at once. After preparing my speech for the occasion, after working upon it for many days, after thinking and feeling much of the grand occasion upon which I was to meet so many of the citizens of my native state, after much anxiety about the journey and about the impression I should make upon the good people of Frederick, in short, after setting out from home, that being Rochester, on the 13th of August, determined to be on time and have a day or two to spare in case of accident, after reaching Washington, and when I was thus just within a few hours of Frederick, lo, I received the following telegram from home, which had reached there just after my departure for Frederick. Mr. Nail telegraphed, do not go to Frederick, will write reason." So I'm not getting into all the vagaries of this, but John Mercer Langston was someone who was on occasion a political ally and on occasion a political enemy of Frederick Douglass. There was kind of a Frederick Douglass faction and a John Mercer Langston faction. Our dear friend George Alfred Townsend in 1872 wrote a little dispatch that was pretty critical of John Mercer Langston. I will not repeat Townsend's critique of Langston, but Townsend was friends with Frederick Douglass and frequently take, let's say, Frederick Douglass' side in political matters. And so George Alfred Townsend writes that Frederick Douglass is from the Eastern Shore. He has a good oystery nature about him. He opens up well. Meaning that Frederick Douglass is very talkative. Douglass has been, in my opinion, unfortunately portrayed, like, for example, in the movie Glory, he's portrayed as being very stoic. He's also portrayed in Death by Lightning, also kind of stoic. In Good Lord Bird, I'm not even going to comment on his portrayal in that. I think that's rather embarrassing. But Douglass is portrayed in popular culture as being very stoic, yet he was someone who frequently deployed humor and other sorts of things to make audiences comfortable with him. I'll give a shout out to our dear friend Matt Borders from Michigan. Frederick Douglass was speaking in Ann Arbor, Michigan one time. A gentleman approached him and said, "Sir, Mr. Douglass, I am the son of a United States Senator." Frederick Douglass said, "Oh, well, I have reason to believe that I am as well." So, kind of a little bit of levity in the evening. All right, so now to the meat of the presentation. All right, so this is an announcement. Frederick Douglass lecture, Self-Made Men, which was kind of like a motivational self-help speech, kind of a Tony Robbins sort of thing. Kind of Douglass would actually, interestingly enough, he would Douglass drew large crowds, frequently integrated crowds. He would sometimes say, okay, I'd like to address my white brothers and sisters. Then he would say, I'd like to address my black brothers and sisters, and kind of give, like I said, kind of political advice and address certain contemporary affairs. So Self-Made Men, he probably delivered about 200 times, but he would add in whatever, like I said, the kind of contemporary political issue of the day. But it was kind of like his standard fallback speech. And the Third Street Church is Quinn Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Church. I have not taken time to research, at least in Frederick, why the tickets may have been sold, where they were, but frequently these would have been people involved in the local Republican Party. And as you can see, general admission was 25 cents. And I guess if you got an advanced ticket was 25 cents, the day was 50 cents. All right. I want to give an acknowledgement because I like to try to acknowledge as much as I can local community historians. The gentleman, I don't know if his name is it Chris Hall?
Yeah.
Chris Hall at Mount Olivet Cemetery is doing wonderful work. Many of the gentlemen that were on stage with Frederick Douglass are buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, as well as Francis Scott Key, who married a member of the Lloyd family. And I'm very glad that the Frederick Keys are back in Frederick as affiliated with the Baltimore Orioles, and I have been consistently making comments on their Facebook page that if we can do we should do a Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner bobblehead and a Frederick Douglass bobblehead, because they did George Alfred Townsend bobblehead in Hagerstown several years ago, and then maybe we can also do the John Brown bobblehead. I think those will be popular because everyone knows that Orioles are doing a Tupac bobblehead this season. So nonetheless, all right. So Chris Hall in 2016 or so, I believe, did a blog post about Douglass and Frederick. So like I said, I want to acknowledge his work. He's done wonderful work. I don't know him personally, correspond over email. And there is also a book, I believe, Frederick Day by Day. That is a brief little line about Frederick Douglass visiting Frederick. So for those community historians that have really excavated print and online sources, you may come across Douglass in Frederick. I'll just read this in full. So lecture by Frederick Douglass. On Tuesday evening, Honorable Frederick Douglass lectured in the City Hall on self-made men. Mr. Douglass has a very attractive musical voice of great compass, a fine, commanding, and prepossessing appearance, easy and graceful delivery, and a faculty of commanding the profoundest attention from his hearers. His diction is of pure Saxon, and his style is terse, incisive, and clear, eminently practical and quite sparkling with strong poetic imagery and sharp-tongued satire. He presented an earnest argument in favor of honest labor by all men, based upon not only real necessity, but also upon the dignity of labor itself. The man that did not work was not fit to live. This idea was emphasized with great force and much apposite illustration. Self-made men are those who have made diligent use of the advantages within their reach and the conditions with which they are directly surrounded. As regards the colored people, they have the right to a fair chance in this country and to every result that industry and honest living could secure for them. We have rarely listened to a more interesting lecture. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Douglass saying jokingly that he believed Douglass jokingly believed that his father may have been Edward Lloyd. He jokingly said that. He did not believe that, and it's possible that Aaron Anthony, it's a whole other story in the Eastern Shore, is probably his biological father. But when it says that Douglass has diction of purest Saxon, Douglass in his later autobiographies acknowledges Daniel Lloyd, who is the youngest son of Edward Lloyd V, as Douglass says he picked up a lot from Daniel Lloyd. Daniel Lloyd attended Princeton University. It's my belief this is a completely discursive tangent. I apologize for that, but I gotta get this in. Lafayette visited Frederick. There's a marker right around the corner. It's my belief that Frederick Douglass was very deliberate in sharing what he wanted to share about his time as an enslaved young person. There's paintings, some may have seen, like Charles Carroll, and there's like an unidentified black body servant, valet, aide-de-camp is a military term. It is my opinion that when Edward Lloyd V was serving as United States Senator and was in Annapolis, Baltimore, and Washington, when Lafayette visited these places, that Daniel Lloyd would have been with Edward Lloyd V, and if Daniel Lloyd was there, so was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass goes to Paris, he visits the grave of Lafayette. I think that Douglass was careful in what he disclosed because if he disclosed maybe certain privileges and advantages that he was afforded, it would have in some ways delegitimized himself as a, I don't know, rough and rugged individual who had escaped slavery. That's a whole other conversation for the whole other time, but I have significant evidence to base that on, and so I wanted to acknowledge that maybe when Frederick Douglass visited Frederick City and was walking, someone said, oh, you know, Mr. Douglass, Lafayette Stadium. Oh, well, I had a chance to see, I was one of the 4 million Americans that saw Lafayette on his return to America. And I did not get a chance to attend the celebrations here in Frederick, but I understand that Frederick City showed out to celebrate Lafayette's return, the bicentennial return. All right, so Brewers Alley, I encourage everyone when they visit there, tell your waiters, did you know that Frederick Douglass spoke here? Which he did. And my understanding is the architectural features, the Moorish arches and some of the ornamentation around the windows, it has not been whitewashed, it has not been altered, it's still very much the building that Frederick Douglass would have seen with his own eyes, or at least the exterior. And I believe he spoke, and I've not had the pleasure to visit the 3rd floor. I believe that's where the Opera House was, or maybe even the 2nd floor was kind of two levels of seating. But Frederick Douglass spoke inside that building, and I had corresponded with Drew Gruber many years ago. I know he's no longer with the Civil War Trails, but maybe at some point we can put an additional sign that says Frederick Douglass spoke at Brewers Alley, and he shared the stage with several significant Frederictonians. So Honorable Frederick Douglass lectured last night at the City Hall. I apologize, this is an iPhone picture off of a microfilm in the Maryland room with our dear friend Mary Mannix. I'm just going to get into a couple of these individuals. So Charles Washington Miller is buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, as is Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner. I'm going to talk a little bit about General John Steiner, Captain Henry Clay Nale, and Reverend Francis J. Peck, as well as Dr. James Henry Andrew Johnson, who actually is very closely affiliated with Hagerstown, my dear friend Doug, which I will have to speak when I speak in Hagerstown about that gentleman, but I do have a slide about him. All right, so like I said, I'm not a Civil War historian, but I understand that this gentleman was significant in Civil War history here in Frederick. General Steiner, 86 years, this is when he passed away. He's 86 years old, well-known citizen of Frederick and a prominent Republican, died Sunday afternoon. At the outbreak of the Civil War with the late Colonel William P. Malsby and General Edward Schreiber, from the famous Schreiber family, he organized the 1st Maryland Regiment, and he served with the regiment until after the Battle of Gettysburg. During the war, he was in charge of the troops quartered at Druid Hill Park in Baltimore City. Before the war, he was a Whig and then became a strong Union man and affiliated with the Republican Party. And he later served, I believe, in the state legislature, and he's buried, as mentioned, at Mount Olivet Cemetery. So when Frederick Douglass came to Frederick, some of the most prominent citizens, those who had honorably served the Union, they welcomed and greeted Frederick Douglass, kind of put their arm on his shoulder, said, Frederick Douglass is my friend, glad to welcome you, Mr. Douglass. It's interesting that there were reports that the crowd was not as significant as it should have been because several churches were having annual functions, and that the loyalty to the church was stronger than the loyalty to hear Mr. Douglass, which is kind of interesting, but it was reported as a very significant audience. All right, this is another, I love this guy, Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner. I'm sure some of you know him. Very fascinating guy. So Frederick Douglass shared the stage with native Frederictonian and Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner, a physician, served with the Army of the Potomac and U.S. Sanitary Commission. Following the Civil War, Dr. Steiner advocated for schools for Black children here in Frederick County. He was an advocate for colored school system. He was the founding librarian of the Enoch Pratt system. He served until his death in 1892. His son, Bernard, then took over the library. He's buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Interestingly enough, there's a gentleman named Ray Williams. Okay? He was a Black Catholic who was on the trajectory to be the first Black ordained Catholic priest. For various reasons, he actually studied in Rome. He ended up not becoming a priest. He left the ministry. He was a teacher here in Frederick County's color school system. When the Enoch Pratt Library is founded, Dr. Steiner brings Mr. Williams with him, and Mr. Williams, who later taught at Catholic University, he's buried in New York City, was the first Black employee of the Enoch Pratt Library. And interestingly about these associations and connections, Frederick Douglass is sharing the stage with those who are also advancing and promoting and advocating for the rights of Black Americans. And I think this is really critical, where I guess the term would be like liberal or progressive, where these gentlemen champion the same causes that Frederick Douglass did. And Dr. Steiner served as a state senator in Annapolis. He attended the 1876 GOP convention in Cincinnati, which, if anyone has seen Death by Lightning, which I think is a pretty good portrayal of kind of the political machinery of how presidential candidates were decided. Frederick Douglass's attendance at these conventions were very important to the network. And so Douglass, when he's here in Frederick, it's an extension of this political network that is local, statewide, and national. And Dr. Steiner seems like a pretty good guy. I'll get a little bit into the famous account that he wrote about Confederates in Frederick. And this is that's Dr. Steiner there on the horse. I'm sure some people have probably seen this photo before. There is a marker in the Enoch Pratt Library on the second floor that acknowledges Dr. Steiner and his importance to Baltimore City's public library system. Now, Baltimore historically was a segregated city of segregated kind of public facilities. The Pratt Library was not segregated. Okay, part of the mission of Mr. Pratt of founding it was that it was to be open to all genders, all nationalities, all races, and who better to pick to administer that integration policy than Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner, who was friends with Frederick Douglass. All right. Now, going a little bit back and forth. So these gentlemen that shared the stage with Frederick Douglass in Frederick were familiar faces to the Black community in Frederick and in Frederick County in Western Maryland, and they frequently attended emancipation celebrations, political rallies, and I'm just going to focus here on, here's Charles Washington Miller. It says a meeting of colored voters was held in the basement of the courthouse on Tuesday, this being Frederick County Courthouse. Charles W. Miller was present and addressed the voters, the Corn Cob Club. And on the bottom it says that so postmasters were a critical part of patronage, federal patronage. I believe in the 1960s, postmasters then became just civil service. And so some of Postmaster General John A.J. Cresswell of Port Deposit, Maryland, worked very, very closely with Frederick Douglass and other Black leaders to essentially help to integrate the post office. So in areas of the Confederacy, when like in Baltimore, the Baltimore Police Department was controlled by former Confederates, other local public works were controlled by kind of those that might have been Confederate leaning, whereas the Customs House was federal and the post office was federal. So therefore, Black Baltimoreans, Black Frederictonians are welcomed into this civil service by folks like Charles W. Miller. So I have not looked through the records. I don't know if anything's ever been written on the employment roles of the Frederick City Post Office, but I speculate that Frederick Douglass would not have shared the stage with Charles W. Miller if he did not employ Black postal workers. And John A.J. Cresswell, as I mentioned, he actually introduced the postcard to the U.S. Mail system. And it's a pretty interesting figure. And he would actually write to Frederick Douglass saying, Mr. Douglass, I have several openings in these various post offices. Do you know some gentlemen in Charleston, South Carolina, or Georgia, or Maryland, who might have the credentials and of upstanding moral character who would help me to fill these positions? And today, I believe 27% of the Postal Service is staffed by Black Americans, which is more than twice demographically Black Americans' population. And the the contemporary employment ranks of the United States Postal Service goes back to John A.J. Cresswell, working alongside individuals such as Frederick Douglass. So here's the terms of office of Mr. Charles W. Miller, Postmaster of Frederick City, Maryland, expired about 10 days ago, and President Hayes has reappointed him for another term of 4 years. Mr. Miller has already held the place for 8 years. The office is worth upwards of $2,000 per year. Mr. Miller has the influence of Congressman Milton Erner, and so although postmasters were not elected positions, it was very important that they were seen and known in the community, and so Mr. Miller made himself a familiar face. And here is an Emancipation Day celebration where Henry Clay Neill and Charles W. Miller are in attendance. So what I guess I'm saying is that the gentleman shared the stage with Frederick Douglass. It was not the only time that they aligned themselves with Black community and advanced the interests of Black Frederick Douglass. All right. I'm really tired. I'm going a little slow. But I will try to speed it up. But everyone, you guys doing all right? You hear me clap once. You hear me clap twice. All right. So Henry Clay Neill is another interesting guy. He's buried in Carroll County. He was at one time, I believe, the head of the Customs House in Baltimore, which is keep referring to death by lightning because it's a very interesting insight into kind of Reconstruction politics. So the Customs House was also very critical to patronage, whereas when Black voters voted significantly for the Republican Party, they would then, after the election, say, okay, what are our spoils, let's say, of our support for the Republican Party? And patronage within the post office, Customs House were ways that Black folks could reap the benefits of their political participation. All right. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to get too much into this, but so there was, before you had the current primary system, there would be county conventions that would select delegates. Western Maryland historically, Maryland's 6th congressional district was the most reliably Republican district following the Civil War. Southern Maryland is kind of on and off again. I don't know if everyone knows. What's the guy? Not Samuel, but his nephew was a pretty important political gentleman, Southern Maryland. So Douglass was very involved in Republican Party politics, advancing the interests of Black Americans. And so these gentlemen here, congressional nomination, the 6th Maryland Congressional Republican Convention met yesterday at Frederick, nominated Lloyd Lowndes Jr., who was the only, still the only governor in the state's history from Allegheny County. He was friends with Frederick Douglass, and then mentions Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner and Captain Henry Clay Neill. I don't know if anyone knows this gentleman, Lewis McComas, who his political opponents would kind of say he was very handsome, kind of dandified. You can see his kind of put a nice appearance. Douglass was very, it's not, as I mentioned to a gentleman earlier, Frederick Douglass is frequently portrayed as kind of a national figure. Even when he's promoted in the state of Maryland, he's affiliated with Baltimore, he's affiliated with the Eastern Shore. Not many people are going to tell you that Frederick Douglass frequently spoke at local political rallies. He spoke at a political rally in Bladensburg for the congressional candidate in the 5th district. I don't believe that Douglass attended this political rally in Rockville, but he was announced. This was in 1876 when Lewis McComas first ran for Congress and did not win. But Douglass had I believe, the intention to put his support behind these candidates to advance the Republican Party in Maryland. All right. So Quinn Chapel was founded, various sources will say it was founded before 1800. William Paul Quinn was part of the first meeting of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was founded in 1816. I don't know if anyone knows, Richard Allen was kind of just the founding father of the AME Church. Bishop William Paul Quinn was kind of a circuit rider. He traveled throughout Western Maryland, Pennsylvania, establishing AME churches. This book was published, I believe, last year by Cheryl LaRoche, Apostle of Liberation, AME Bishop Paul Quinn in the Underground Railroad. I would encourage anyone who's interested in this book, also available at the Frederick County Public Library, to read up on Bishop Quinn. He passes away in the 1870s. Frederick Douglass did have some connections with Bishop Quinn. And so as the AME Church was founded in Philadelphia, the first AME Church was founded in Maryland and Baltimore, and they kind of followed the national road, went from Baltimore to Frederick to Hagerstown to Cumberland to Frostburg. And so Douglas is very closely affiliated with the AME Church. Douglas sometimes would be critical of organized religion, and he would say that God did not answer his prayers when he prayed on his knees, but answered his prayers when he prayed on his feet, meaning when he escaped slavery. And Douglas would say, he got in trouble with some ministers after the Civil War, where he basically said that politics and our own political agitation helped emancipation, and it was lesser the ministers. And so Douglas was kind of not viewed favorably by the ministers for several years, so I believe he kind of went on a little bit of a reclamation tour and made a deliberate effort to speak to benefit these churches. And so we are very fortunate that Quinn Chapel still exists here in Frederick, very much the church that Frederick Douglass would have seen with his own eyes. This is the 1873 Titus map of Frederick City. The arrow is pointing at it says African Methodist Episcopal Church. So Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman was pastor of Quinn Chapel during the Civil War. The AME Church had a system where essentially every year there'd be a new rotation, and Frederick Douglass was several ministers that did a tenure of service here. Frederick, on your left is Bishop James Handy, who was born free in Baltimore in 1826. He actually knew Frederick Douglass before he was Frederick Douglass, when he was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in Baltimore City. So he was actually someone who as a child looked up to Frederick Douglass. There's the Maryland Historical Trust report on Quinn Chapel. There's really not a lot on Quinn Chapel. Some sources will say that it was used as a hospital during the Civil War, which I believe almost every church, probably in Frederick City and Shepherdstown, was used as a hospital. I've not seen any documentation on that, but it makes sense because Quinn Chapel as a building existed at that time. And so this is an interesting little anecdote. So this Henry Ossawa Tanner, who's a very famous painter. He was the son of Bishop Benjamin Tucker Tanner, who also served Quinn Chapel. And Bishop Tanner was an administrator of the Freedmen's Bureau schools in Frederick County and areas of Western Maryland. So this is a little anecdote that he writes down. The Tanner family would have been living in the parsonage, which I don't have a picture of it, but it's the building that's to the left of Quinn Chapel. There's a little two-story wood frame structure, and that's where the Tanner family lived. I know that Frederick Douglass spent the night at the Washington House in Hagerstown. He spent the night at the Queen City Hotel in Cumberland. I do not know if he spent the night in Frederick City. Don't think he could have taken a train back to Washington that night. Don't know what hotel he may have stayed in. I believe that he possibly would have stayed in the parsonage due to his relationship with the Peck family, which I will try to get to in just a minute. All right, so Henry Ossawa Tanner writes. So Henry was just 6 years old when the Civil War ended, and his memories of it are vague, but one incident remained with him. The Tanners were living in Frederick, Maryland at the time. So this is from a diary entry that he writes, or a biographical memoir that he writes. He writes, quote, "From our attic window, the rebel camp and soldiers could be seen. Once my father, for some cause, was at the little station at the train station, and by his clothes was recognized as a minister. Hello, Sambo, what are you doing with those duds on? Take this." And he was kicked out of the station. I believe my father said he was drunk, that being the soldier. Rebel soldiers passed their house all day long, but the Reverend Mr. Tanner took the precaution of nailing up the windows to make it look vacant. Only once did a rebel soldier stop and bang on the door, but an officer sent him on. So if you look from that attic window, you can see it's about a block and a half down. You can see Market Street, which this is a photo that I believe a couple of years ago they actually kind of correctly identified the location. And Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner writes in 1862 in his diary kind of the recollection of the Confederates marching through Frederick, and it's pretty well known. Like I said, I'm not a Civil War historian, so I will not get into this, but so see kind of some of those cross associations and overlaps of individuals who knew Frederick Douglass touch on Civil War history. All right, this is Bishop Tanner's family. Henry is, I believe, standing there. All right. So this is critical. It's my belief that, so Douglas spoke in Frederick due to political associations, political networks, but he did speak explicitly to benefit Quinn Chapel. And the pastor at Quinn Chapel at that time was a gentleman named Francis Jesse Peck Sr. He is buried at a cemetery in Petersville. Francis Jesse Peck Sr.'s father was Nathaniel Peck. As a teen in Baltimore City in the 1830s, an enslaved Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey attended sermons of Reverend Nathaniel Peck, who's pictured there, at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore. As an avid supporter of the AME Church in Washington City and throughout areas of Maryland, Frederick Douglass worked with Reverend Nathaniel Peck's son, Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Sr., and his grandson, Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Jr. Frederick Douglass knew 3 generations of Pecks. He also knew Reverend John Peck, who was in Pittsburgh, who was Reverend Nathaniel Peck's brother. And this is really interesting. This is taking me kind of years to unravel. There are actually several families, politicians, ministers, educators, where Douglass knew three generations, in some cases even 4 generations of individuals. All right. Now I do not have a picture of Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Sr., but I have a picture of his father and his son. So this is a subscription list for the Christian Recorder in late 1878. Reverend Francis J. Peck of Quinn Chapel AME Church recruited 10 subscribers, while Reverend Joseph P. Shreves in Hagerstown recruited 20. Reverend Shreves was the gentleman who was responsible for Douglass speaking in Hagerstown. Both of these pastors were integral in securing the benefit lectures of Frederick Douglass, for their respective churches. Several of the listed pastors served Quinn Chapel and AME churches throughout Frederick City. So of these pastors, about half of them at one time were appointed to Frederick City. And so it's very possible that when Douglass is on stage at Brewer's Alley and Reverend Peck gives kind of an opening prayer or kind of a benediction, Douglass might have said, "You remind me just of your dad," which I'm sure would have maybe meant a lot to Reverend Peck. All right. Now, Reverend Francis Jesse Peck, some of this I'm repeating a little bit. So Reverend Francis Jesse Peck was born in Baltimore. He's buried in Petersville. His son, Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Jr., attended Storer College. This is Reverend Peck Jr. Reverend Peck Jr. most likely attended Frederick Douglass's address here in Frederick. I also believe maybe Theophilus Thompson, who was the chess player, he probably attended Douglass's address in Frederick because he was a teacher in the Frederick City's colored school system. And I don't know if anyone knows this cemetery in Petersville. It's kind of up a little bit of a dirt road. And so this gentleman was on stage with Frederick Douglass here in Frederick. And interestingly enough, his family ran essentially an Airbnb in Petersville. Now, before they ran the Airbnb in Petersville, they actually ran, does anyone know the Lockwood House in Harper's Ferry? Excellent. All right, so several of the structures on Fillmore Street in Harper's Ferry during the academic year of Storer College, these buildings were all built during when Harper's Ferry had the armory. Following the Civil War, they were essentially abandoned. Future President James A. Garfield, as a congressman from Ohio, was very pivotal in securing these buildings being transferred from the federal government to Storer College, which unfortunately there's not a single mention of President Garfield's involvement with Storer College on the former grounds of Storer College nonetheless. So during the vacation season or excursion season, several prominent Baltimoreans, Washingtonians, former Union generals, former Confederate generals, they would summer in Harper's Ferry. And so the Peck family was kind of the maitre d's of Lincoln Hall. The Lovett family were the maitre d's of the Lockwood House. The Lovett family would build the Hilltop House, which I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to stay there. It closed a little bit before my time. And by 1884, 1885, the Peck family most likely have, same with the Lockwood house, the Lovett family, due to their superior hospitality services and their 5-star service. Through various tips and other methods, they were able to secure enough capital to build the Hilltop House. The Peck family were able to secure enough capital to secure several lots in Petersville, and several buildings, and they actually advertised in black newspapers in Washington, D.C. Summer Resorts Avondale will be opened by the reception of guests June 25th, 1888. Miss Esther Amos Peck, who was the wife of Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Sr., was the proprietress. Her son, Francis Jesse Peck Jr., was the manager, and it's pretty interesting. I don't know if has anyone seen the new book about the Hilltop House? If this is being recorded, I said I would give a shout out to my dear friend Cynthia. So then there's a new book about the Hilltop House. It's very well done. I encourage anyone who's interested in local history to pick that book up. I'm sure it's probably available at the Frederick County Public Library System, or it's available at the gift shop in Harpers Ferry. The author advances a belief that the Lovett family, which is a black family, only opened their hotel to white patrons or white customers. Initially, when I was in correspondence with the author, I said, I don't think that's really true. Frederick Douglass knew the Lovetts, the Peck family knew the member of the Lovett family actually visited the Peck family when they were living in Anacostia, right around the corner from Frederick Douglass. And a dear friend of mine, Cynthia Braden, at I believe it's called Steam at Harpers Ferry. It's a blog. Essentially, in the past month or so, has almost single-handedly undermined the premise of the book about the Hilltop House, that the Hilltop House was not a segregated, whites-only hotel run by black folks, that it was an integrated hotel. Nonetheless, it was a very upscale hotel, whereas I would have had been someone of means, high-level government clerk, and I don't know if anyone knows Julia Anna Cooper, who was the principal of the M Street School, Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. She actually received her PhD in Paris at La Sorbonne, and she actually defended her dissertation in Francois. Okay, so she was bilingual. If anyone knows, what is someone who can speak 3 languages? Trilingual. What is someone who can speak 2 languages? Bilingual. What is someone who can speak 1 language? American. All right. All right, so the point about it is that Harpers Ferry is frequently regarded as a destination for excursionists. Well, areas of Frederick County were as well. And so the Peck family, that were a very much, it's kind of a dated term, but like a race family, or a family that worked for several generations to uplift black Americans. And Carter G. Woodson's 1830 survey of free black families in the United States, there are several Peck surnames. So Frederick Douglass would not have associated with black individuals that discriminated against black individuals. So hopefully that was not too long of a discursive mention, but the Peck family was very prominent, and Mary Mannix was very kind to deploy one of her research assistants to actually pull the land records and deeds from Avondale, and Esther Peck died in 1909. I believe she had about 20 acres. So Avondale was quite a resort, and maybe in the future someone will pick up and research that out some time. But there's as I've done research, I continuously come across things that they require much more research that I just don't have time to get into. All right, let me try to speed this along. So another interesting gentleman, of the many venerable men of the cloth who served northwestern Maryland's cluster of historic African Methodist Episcopal churches, Reverend James Henry Andrew Johnson is noted for an especially significant literary life work that extended beyond the pulpit into journalism, political commentary, and denominational history. Similar to Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Sr. and Reverend Joseph P. Shreves, Reverend Johnson would maintain an association with Frederick Douglass following their time together in Western Maryland. Following their sharing a stage in Frederick City in April 1879 to benefit Queen Chapel, Douglas and Johnson would make more than a half dozen public appearances together, mostly in support of the AME Church in an alliance that joined moral authority, political advocacy, and religious leadership. All right, let me take a step back. I apologize. So this gentleman was assigned to Campbell AME Church on present-day Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. When Frederick Douglass Jr. dies in 1892, Reverend Francis Jesse Peck Jr., this gentleman officiates Frederick Douglass Jr.'s funeral. So Frederick Douglass selected Reverend Peck to eulogize his son, to deliver those services, and it probably meant something to Frederick Douglass that he knew his grandfather. Some of this is a little difficult to articulate. Sometimes you have to feel it a little bit. But Frederick Douglass maintained close connections and association with individuals that a lot of the Douglass studies really don't get into, and they just kind of pass over these things that to me are extremely significant. All right. So Reverend Johnson, for our Civil War historians, he was freeborn in Baltimore City. He was affiliated with Christian A. Fleetwood. They published together a black newspaper in Baltimore during the time of the Civil War. He was a barber. He got involved with the AME Church. Bishop Wayman actually, ordained is the right word, but essentially Bishop Wayman kind of, I guess, made him a deacon. Following Sherman's march to the sea, Reverend Johnson was deployed to the Sea Islands, and there are two different historic markers in South Carolina that mentioned Reverend Johnson and essentially helping to establish the AME Church in South Carolina. All right, so this is a pretty famous photo of a Black Civil War band, and the Moxley Band gets a lot of attention. I think it's time that the Jenkins Cornet Band of Frederick City join alongside the Moxley Band. All right, so alongside Moxley's Cornet Band of Hagerstown, Maryland, one of the showpiece bands of Western Maryland was Jenkins Cornet Band of Frederick City, led by Robert Jenkins. Robert Jenkins is buried in St. John's Cemetery, where Justice Tawney is, Chief Justice Tawney is also buried. And you'll see in the highlight there, Jenkins Cornet Band will be in attendance. This was at a I can't roller skate at all. My wife really likes roller skating. I know it's a big thing, and like historically, it's been a very very big thing. Recreational activity for Black Americans, and so Jenkins Cornet Band was called upon to serenade roller skaters. And here is a Republican rally, the Grand Parade and Rally under the auspices of the Young Men's Republican Club of Frederick City came off last night. It was a decided success. Mentions about 300 and 400 men were each lane. A lot of local participation. The music was furnished by the Frederick City Cornet Band and Jenkins Band. And you'll see Congressman Milton J. Erner is involved in favor of the re-election of Louis McComas, who introduced Frederick Douglass in Hagerstown and was friends with Mr. Douglass. So I really like local history, and I think that just community bands is another thing that's really understudied. In almost every community, there would be kind of like a white band and a black band. I know there's a historic literature that, like Bartonsville had a black community band. There was Burkittsville had a black community band. And so Jenkins Cornet Band is, my estimation, performed over 50 times that I can find. It actually slowly put together a chronology of Moxley Band. Moxley Band performed from 1850s until the 1940s at least 90 times. And when Frederick Douglass would visit towns, frequently he would be greeted at the train station or the steamboat dock by a cornet band. I don't believe Jenkins Cornet Band was involved in Douglass's time here in Frederick, but it's possible another source may reveal that. They were very prominent in performing in Emancipation Day events. Has anyone ever heard of the Jenkins Cornet Band before? Oh, you have now. All right, so closing this out, you've been a wonderful audience. I really appreciate everybody braving the elements today. Thank you for rolling with me. And this is something that 5 years ago I did not have this mat, and I want to give acknowledgement to our dear friend, community honorable historian, librarian extraordinaire, Mary Mannix, who's the guardian of this historic record. So I don't know if anyone here had the pleasure of knowing Mr. Jacob Engelbrecht. I did not know him, but I'm very familiar with his work. It gets a lot of attention, as it should. Mr. Engelbrecht documented ongoings in the Black community. Unfortunately, his journal ends right about the time that Frederick Douglass visits Frederick. I think there's a couple entries for 1879, but it kind of skips over Douglass's visit. I don't know if his son might have been keeping the journal at the time, but Mr. Engelbrecht's journal gets a lot of attention. Quinn's hardware ledger receives a little bit less attention. This is held by the Frederick County Library System, and as you can see, this is from February 20, 1895. On your left is the whole page. This is a close-up. So it says, sleighing broke up today. Maybe they had Snow Creek back then as well. So we had a little bit of snow on the ground. It says, Frederick Douglass, in parentheses, the colored orator, dies age 78. So I think this is pretty significant that someone at the hardware store thought it significant enough to mention along with the weather and other sorts of things of daily interest and intrigue that Frederick Douglass, who at one time had stepped foot in our community, he has passed away. All right, so that is the conclusion. You guys have been a wonderful audience. I don't know if there were any comments online, any questions, because there's 2 people tuning in online. All right, we have some wonderful people in the audience here. I can see you're bristling with questions and curiosity. So be glad to take any comments, questions, critiques you may have. Just a brief administrative announcement. So Matt was very generous and kind to invite me to speak tonight. I think he initially did so because he thought I was going to have Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland to show you. Unfortunately, due to, I'm guessing some people here have grandchildren, children, and it kind of, things take a little longer than you initially anticipated. So I've had to push the deadline back a couple times, but I am confident that Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland will be published this year, which is very significant to our country's history. And so I encourage people to be on the lookout for that book. I will send it when the book is published. I will make sure that the Civil War Roundtable gets a complimentary copy. And nonetheless, I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. And if you want to reach out to me, that's how you can reach me. And if you have any questions or comments, fire away.
This is kind of a dumb question, but the name of the churches are always Methodist, Episcopalian. Now, I'm curious, today the 2 churches are quite separate, and I understand right. One being a little more like England, of course, and the other one a little more middle of the Christian beliefs, I think. So I'm curious, did they actually combine those 2 churches to make, because they all had that title?
I'm going to use a sports analogy where, like today in Frederick, we have Quinn Chapel, AME Church, and Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church. So it's kind of like the American League and the National League. Because they both play baseball. They're both Black churches, but administratively, they kind of are. They're administrated by different organizations. Whereas, so you had John Wesley is involved with the Church of England. He's not the appropriate word, but I'll say he's basically excommunicated or kicked out of the Church of England. He goes and he's preaching in the streets. One of the tenets of Methodism is that you cannot be a member of the Methodist Church if you are a slaveholder. So Methodism is exported to America. It's my belief that that Maryland can rightfully claim Methodism. I think 100 years ago, New York and Maryland were arguing. Okay, the Strawbridge Shrine is in Carroll County. Is that right? So Robert Strawbridge in 1762 has the first Methodist meeting in America. It's in Maryland, not too far from where we are. The Methodist Church had black preachers, had black, I don't know if I would say members, but Bishop Francis Asbury baptized black individuals, and both free and enslaved individuals were kind of involved in the church. In 1816, Richard Allen has a formal fissure with the Methodist Episcopal Church, or today it's known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. It's the Methodist Church then. So you had the AME Church is founded in 1816 and kind of develops on its own. You still had black members of the Methodist Church that in 1864 you have the Washington Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is essentially administratively the black churches within the larger Methodist denominations. I'm not really a theological or a theologian or a history of Methodist Church, but it's you still see this today where many cities, many towns, there are like two black churches, and there's an AME church and then usually an Asbury Methodist Church, and they are both under the umbrella of Methodism. But like I said, administratively, you have one is like the American League and one is like the National League. That's not necessarily the best analogy, but or we like the NFC and the AFC. That's cool.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's as good as I've heard.
It's a very complicated, nuanced history. Now, Frederick Douglass was licensed to be a preacher in the AME Zion Church. The AME Zion Church is more closely affiliated with New York. It is believed that in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, early on, there is a black preacher portrayed. It's believed that Herman Melville probably actually saw Frederick Douglass preach at a church in, I don't know if Douglass might have been in Lynn, Massachusetts, or New Bedford. I heard someone say Bedford earlier today. So Douglass, when he escapes Baltimore in 1838, he moves to Massachusetts. He becomes involved in the Methodist AME Zion Church, and people would frequently refer to Frederick Douglass as Dr. Douglass, Honorable Frederick Douglass, Minister Douglass, Marshal Douglass, and even sometimes Reverend Douglass, because people did think that he was formally ordained, but he never was formally ordained. And it's, especially later on in life, Douglass becomes more closely affiliated with the AME Church. There is something that Douglass writes that is actually published posthumously, where Douglass basically says the happiest times of his life were spent as kind of a licensed preacher in his early 20s.
You got two New Bedford people here sitting in the back row, and we can vouch for the fact that there is an AME church in downtown New Bedford, and we're Melville fans as well. I drove down from Chambersburg this evening
Oh, thank you.
because this my dear friend and I are from New Bedford, and he just moved in 2 weeks ago.
Hey,
So I'm here for the first time in a couple of years. And I want to say that being in Chambersburg is a very dear affinity to Frederick Douglass, because as some of you know, he arrives in Chambersburg to meet with John Brown as John Brown gathering his ammunition in this house in downtown Chambersburg, where he stays for a few months before heading to Harper's Ferry. But I did not know until you spoke about the fact that Frederick Douglass stayed in the same house that John Brown, the hotel or the motel or whatever it was, Washington House or something, where John Brown had stayed on his way to Harper's Ferry.
I'll say this very briefly, and then if Doug, if you want to say a couple of comments, I'd be glad for you to grab the mic. So the John Clinton Fry Western Maryland Room at the Hagerstown Central Branch of the Washington County Free Library has a ledger of the Washington House that I believe George Alfred Townsend was actually responsible for somehow finding or locating. I'm not really sure how the library got in their archives. but there is an entry where, Doug, you can correct me if I'm mistaken, but John Brown used the alias of Isaac Smith.
Correct.
And he writes Isaac Smith and Sons, and it's actually in what's believed to be John Brown's handwriting. Now, unfortunately, someone at some time, probably in the early 1900s, put like a piece of paper and glued it on there that says like this is John Brown's signature, etc. But they have the original document, and when Douglas visits Hagerstown, he does stay overnight at the Washington House. When Douglas stayed at Washington House, Tom Thumb, who was a big draw for P.T. Barnum's, it actually says Tom Thumb and Entourage stayed there. I dare to speculate, if Frederick Douglass sees Mr. Thumb, has a conversation, and maybe Mr. Thumb later that evening, he would portray Napoleon and portray George Washington, maybe he portrayed Frederick Douglass. I don't know. I don't know that Frederick Douglass was in Tom Thumb's notes repertoire of impersonations, but and I actually just found that a couple weeks ago, where it listed the hotel arrivals. But yes, Douglas has connections to Chambersburg. I do want to acknowledge my dear friend Doug Dobbs, who portrays very honorably Captain John Brown. Doug, if you want to maybe say a couple words or tell us some upcoming presentations you have.
Sure. My name is Doug Dobbs. I'm easy to find on Facebook.
He looks like John Brown.
You're meeting lots of people. You read about Captain Brown and Frederick Douglass staying together at the widow's house in Chambersburg. If you've never been up there, go down and visit the old jail, and they'll send a docent up to send you around. It's an amazing house. It was restored about 15 years ago. And it's really well done. I've actually sat in the room on some of the furniture, I believe, that Captain Brown sat on, watching his equipment in the railroad sheds nearby. So it's a really cool place to come visit. And if you'd like to see John Brown in person, come talk to me after.
Wow. Thank you, AKA Captain Brown. All right, yes, sir.
Just real quick, the audience, was it primarily a black audience? Was it primarily a white audience? Or was it a mixed audience? Say at Blue Brewers Alley, for instance.
Well,
Who showed up?
yeah, the reporting, and this is pretty custom, where, and this is actually his address in Cumberland is outdoors, and reportedly there were people traveling from all other towns, and a lot significant black presence in Cumberland. His address in Hagerstown and Frederick, they're almost similar. The way they said that some of our town's most prominent citizens were there of both political parties to hear Mr. Frederick Douglass, whether out of curiosity or interest or just to say I wanted to see Mr. Frederick Douglass, and they you say after Douglass's address, our most prominent citizens went up to him and shook his hand, but they would say that it was an integrated audience. If I had to interpret from the newspaper reportage, I would probably say maybe 65% white audience, maybe 35% black audience. And I do think that Douglas doing this was in a way where, like in Frederick, and I haven't had time to cross-reference what may have been happening at these churches in town, but that Frederick Douglass is helping the black church raise money from sources that were outside of the black community. So I think that also is kind of critical and important to the story. And as I said, because Douglas is marshal at this particular time, I think that added maybe a certain level of not just necessarily a private citizen, or he's not like rallying against Andrew Johnson at the particular time, or he's not, advocating deliberately for the re-election of President Grant. He's kind of coming on a more nonpartisan sort of speech. He's coming here to benefit the local churches, maybe not as politically charged as some of his other rallies may have been. So that way it may have been potentially disarming to people who otherwise would have said, well, I can't go and hear Douglas speak tonight because he's stumping for this political candidate who I'm not in support of. And then also, so that's my interpretation. But both Frederick and Hagerstown newspaper reports say our most prominent citizens, and these were like the white newspapers.
They could be white or black. Right.
Yeah, so I believe that like Theophilus Thompson, who was the chess player, He probably was in attendance. Well, I mean, that's my interpretation because if you cross-reference when he was living, he was at that time a teacher in Frederick City's, one of Frederick City's color school systems. Frederick Douglass attended the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, of which Mr. Thompson attended. Frederick Douglass taught his children and grandchildren chess. Douglass actually played chess in Paris with Susan B. Anthony's, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's son. And so, I mean, I kind of have a list of who may have been there. And I kind of have both, what I've identified as prominent black Frederictonians as well as some white Frederictonians. I mean, at least on stage, Frederick Douglass is on stage with an integrated audience. He's on stage with at least two prominent black Methodist preachers and several, kind of leading white political figures in town.
Okay.
I'll go front first.
But on the list, but where was he born?
Frederick Douglass was, the town that they'll say is Cordova, which is is in Talbot County, but right on the border of Caroline County. So Frederick Douglass was born on the Eastern Shore in 1818. He spent the first 6 years of his life with his grandmother in the company of his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who I believe that Frederick Douglass, when his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who was, even though she was legally enslaved, by Douglass's accounts, she would have been involved in the local chamber of commerce. She sold fishing nets. She harvested sweet potatoes. She was known in several communities in the Eastern Shore. There's a gentleman, his first name escapes me. His last name is Carney. Mr. Carney recently was a veteran of the Continental Army. He saved the life of Perry Benson. Perry Benson was buddies with Washington. He received a pension as a result of the Revolutionary War Pension Act of 1818. I believe that when Frederick Douglass was a child with his grandmother, his grandmother did business with at least one or two veterans of the Continental Army that in some way knew George Washington. When Douglass is at White House, there's a painting of Washington in White House. I believe Douglass probably saw Lafayette. In 1888, Douglass says when he was a child, the only birthday he ever knew was George Washington's birthday, because enslaved people would get Washington's birthday off. Douglass used this. I'm sorry, this is not answering your question. I'm trying to get some Washington stuff in here. Douglass used Washington in his anti-slavery propaganda. Of all the founding fathers, Washington had the foresight to see that emancipation was the eventuality of the United States. And there's a letter that Washington writes, I believe, to Robert Morris. I cannot remember the exact paraphrase, but the wording and language that Washington uses essentially says that if I was not constrained, I'm paraphrasing it. Washington says that if I was not constrained by the current contemporary political times, I would advance emancipation because I believe that emancipation is our inevitable future. So Douglass used that letter, or used Washington to say that Washington was in fact not an abolitionist, but an emancipationist. Douglass visited Mount Vernon on several occasions. And so to go back to your question, the influences that Douglass had on the Eastern Shore with his grandmother at White House and the Lloyd family, it's really to put into almost, the Lloyd family was the 1%. They were incredibly influential politically. Lloyd Lowndes from Cumberland was, his father was first cousin to Daniel Lloyd. Henry Lloyd was governor out of Cambridge in the mid-1880s when Governor McLean was appointed minister to France by President Cleveland. So a lot of these influences that Douglass had on the Eastern Shore, he carried with him his entire life. And right, actually, this is an interesting story since you guys seem to be captivated audience. So several years ago, as a student, my dear late friend, Dr. Mark Leone at the University of Maryland, he was a pioneering archaeology professor. There was an archaeology project at White House on areas of the Hill community in Easton, which a lot of different places will say it's the oldest black community in the United States. The Hill claims that. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it's one of the oldest. So there was archaeology work done to confirm or try to determine where Frederick Douglass was born. A PhD student did that work, but then left the program. And so that the dissertation that they wrote can almost like legally never be released. But I believe they actually have, Talbot County as a county does know where they believe Frederick Douglass was born, and there's efforts to possibly purchase it. There's actually a Frederick Douglass Park on Lewistown Road, which I don't know if anyone's been there, but when Harriet Tubman got her park, that probably for a long time is not going to be any money for a Frederick Douglass Park. And I'll just leave it at that. And but yeah, so Frederick Douglass, he some of the quotes that he says is he was an Eastern Shore man, born and bred, and like Eastern Shore pork gave him his muscle. And Douglass definitely identified with his native state of Maryland. I mean, I have Douglass as far west as Frostburg, as far south as Salisbury. When Douglass spoke by accident in Grafton, West Virginia, with former West Virginia Governor Pierpont in October of 1884, he had to have come from the train station in Oakland. Like the train that stopped in Grafton, West Virginia, had to have come through Oakland, Maryland. I don't know that Douglass ever visited the Deer Park Hotel. Oh, here, okay, you guys are good on it. You gotta like this. He's not really related to Douglas MacKinley. So Grover Cleveland is the first Democratic president since James Buchanan. When Grover Cleveland marries what had been his adopted daughter, there's a reception at the White House. Frederick Douglass is in attendance, as is Louis McComas. Louis McComas was a congressman from the Republican Party representing Maryland's 6th district, of which we are currently standing in. So there's a little receiving line, and Congressman McComas shakes President Cleveland's hand and says, "Oh, President Cleveland, I hear that you had your honeymoon at the Deer Park Hotel. I represent the area." And President Cleveland said, "Oh, yes, it's a beautiful area, but I didn't have the pleasure to stay there long enough to vote for you." All right, you guys have been a wonderful audience. Any more comments?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Our next month's speaker will be Jim Rada, speaking on the Daughters of Charity up there in Emmitsburg, particularly during the Gettysburg campaign, but also the Civil War as a whole. So definitely come on back to see us for that.